Hi, this is I am Luna. Hi everybody. I am a Vietnamese communist born and living in Vietnam, and I have a YouTube channel named Luna Ơi. And this is my comrade EJ.
Comrade, partner, spouse. We got the whole package.
Yeah.
I'm EJ. I have a YouTube channel called Non Compete. Luna's channel is called Luna Oi. In case you want to check that out, that's LUNA space OI. But yeah, I've been living in Vietnam for about 10 years now, and still learning more and more about this beautiful country every day. I lived through COVID here. That was a really interesting experience, and just watching this country develop and prosper so much and change and grow and develop so much over the last 10 years has been really an eye-opening experience, and it was a big foundational part of me becoming a communist. So I love this country, and the people here are wonderful, and I feel very welcome here, and yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. That's wonderful. All right, so let's begin with the tough questions.
Oh,
All right.
In
Jump in.
1986, the Communist Party took a very important decision, which is called renovation or reviving the economy. How do you say it in Vietnamese again?
Doi Moi.
Đổi mới.
Doi Moi.
Đổi mới.
And under that policy, then, um, capitalism was to some extent allowed, foreign investment was allowed. So let's start with what was going on between 1975 and 86 that caused the Communist Party to rethink its economic policy.
Yes, this is a very complicated but interesting part of history of Vietnam, because as you know, we won the war against the USA, imperialist USA, in 1975, and at that time, Vietnam was devastated. We were bombed back to Stone Age by the own wars of the USA, and we were sprayed tons and tons of toxins, dioxin, Agent Orange, onto our crops, onto our water, and we was like suffering, and also with napalms and about bombs and a bunch of weapons like that. So we were hungry, we were devastated, and at the same time, this is a very important part of history too. Pol Pot and with the Khmer Rouge was rising in Cambodia, and they were, threatening Vietnam, and they actually attacked the border of Vietnam,
In
and
78,
yeah, in 1970, from 1975 to 1979.
I see.
It took them 4 years to really took power of the country and became really a genocidal regime. In just a matter of 4 years, from 1975 to 1979, they killed 25% of their own population of starvation. I had an old video if you want to learn more about that. But long story short, Vietnam was the only country in the world at that time that dared to stand up and end that genocidal regime of the Khmer Rouge. But that was also a big excuse for the whole world to sanction Vietnam comprehensively, because the Khmer Rouge was backed by both the USA and China under Deng Xiaoping, and also the rest of the United Nations too. So Vietnam, because
Jimmy
of
Carter. Can't leave
Jimmy
Carter.
Carter, yes, USA under Jimmy Carter. So because of that, Vietnam was heavily sanctioned, comprehensively sanctioned by the rest of the world on the already existing condition that we were devastated by the weapons by the USA. So we, after 1975, actively fighting against the Khmer Rouge, we were trying to have a subsidizing model following the Stalin style. And like my mom lived through that times, and she had to talk a lot about that, to tell a lot of stories. But long story short, in that time, we didn't have any money, and we used stamps.
The leader's name
instead.
was Lê Duẩn at that time.
Yeah, the Lê Duẩn was the leader of the Communist Party of Vietnam at the time, and he gave that, decision. And we did not use money, and we used stamps instead, with rice stamps or like pork stamp, meat stamps, or something like that,
Rationing,
and clothes,
basically.
Yeah.
rationing. So we like the economy at the time is totally like centralized kind
So
of plan
before we
like
go
that.
into the economy, just a little more about the Khmer Rouge. So why did Vietnam and Cambodia go to war, given that both were ostensibly communist?
Yeah.
I understand the part about Khmer, sending people into the countryside, but I also heard while I was here in Vietnam that because the old Cambodian kingdom used to extend to some sections of South Vietnam, that the Khmer Rouge people thought that maybe parts of Vietnam ought to be part of Cambodia. Was that also part of the issue?
It is the the false accusation that the Khmer Rouge came up with to justify
Okay.
the anti-Vietnam narratives and to justify the attacks in the border of Vietnam.
Okay.
The truth is this: in the 14th century, there was an empire named Angkor Empire in the south of Cambodia, and they were one of the most powerful empire in Southeast Asia at that time, and they owned from like all the way from Thailand all the way to Cambodia, and then part of a little bit of Vietnam. But actually, the most part of Vietnam in the south was Champa Kingdom, which was a different empire.
I see.
Yes, and then they don't exist anymore. And then after that, they lost to, they lost to the Thai and Vietnam. So that was the south of Vietnam is mostly come from the Champa Kingdom, not from the Angkor Empire. All right.
And in any case, if that's 14th century, that's a long time ago.
Yeah, a long
That's a
time
long
ago.
time ago.
I think it's really important to understand that Pol Pot was an opportunist, and he used communism as a stepping stone to personal power for himself and his regime, and they abandoned the principles of Marxism, Leninism, and communism pretty rapidly, and really developed a fascistic ideology that was based on ethnic supremacism of the Khmer people.
Yeah.
They
believed that the Khmer people were superior, and they were rightful to rule over Vietnam and Laos and Thai too.
They were very racist against Vietnamese people, and ethnically cleansed Vietnamese people from Cambodia, and also came into the borders of Vietnam to murder Vietnamese people in Vietnam as well. So
and there's another thing important too. Like in the 14th, 15th century, the Angkor Empire collapsed because of a drought. Two droughts at the same time. Actually, the drought that lasted for 30 years. It was like weakened the empire, and then they got lost by an army from Thai kingdom. So it's not even like Vietnam was not even involved in this.
Yeah, I don't think that's really a very powerful argument to make on the part of the Khmer Rouge vis-a-vis invading Vietnam or anything of that sort. But I just wanted to understand some of the background here. So then you had the war with China, which was in
1979.
79. Yeah. And that lasted about 2 months or so.
That lasted, the biggest fight lasted for about 2 months in 1979 when, Vietnam, after 4 years of trying to do the diplomatic, solution with Cambodia, like trying to persuade them to stop attacking and killing the Vietnamese people in the border, but we failed. So in 1979, we finally, that is it. We have to send an army there to liberate the victims of the Khmer Rouge there. And that pissed off China under Deng Xiaoping, because Deng Xiaoping was supporting Pol Pot at that time because of the Sino-Soviet split, and Vietnam was on the side with the USSR. And that China didn't like that. They didn't like that. So they used Pol Pot to weaken Vietnam. So that was why in 1979 they launched an attack that lasted about 2 months, and then the both sides continued to kind of withdraw after that. But actually, the conflicts lasted for another 10 years until 1989, like just on and off, on and off.
I see.
Yeah, they only
skirmishes.
Exactly, the skirmishes like on and off for like 9 or 10 years after that. And it only stopped when finally the Khmer Rouge was totally ousted from the Cambodian government.
And that was what year?
1989.
89. That's when Hun Sen was.
Hun Sen was,
Hun Sen.
yes. So in 1974, Hun Sen used to be a team leader of a small group of soldiers of the Khmer Rouge. He deserted. He saw the crimes that the soldiers, the army of the Pol Pot did against the Cambodian people. So he, with a team of 4 other people, crossed the border of Vietnam, and then came here and met us and called for help. And that was why we rose up and we helped him. And also that was why, it became like.
So by 1980, the economic situation of Vietnam was
devastated. By 1980, the economic situation in Vietnam was devastated because we still devastated by the war against America.
Yeah.
We were
First against the
comprehensively
French, then against
sanctioned.
the Japanese, then against the French again, then against the Americans, now against the Cambodians and the Chinese.
With the active sanctions from the rest of the world. So my mom was starving.
So just for my information, so in 75 there were no sanctions. That means the sanctions were imposed in 78, 79.
Yes. Yes.
Interesting.
For the moment of that, from 1975 to 1979, there was virtually no sanction. But also, the U.S. still very sour
Of course.
about the loss.
Naturally.
So they didn't do anything to help at all. It was just on our own. Actually, at that time, we had the help from USSR,
They're
Cuba,
collapsing at that time.
Laos, and USSR collapsing in the 80s, so we couldn't help. It's really sad.
Did Perestroika and Glasnost in 85, 86 have any impact on the 86 reforms here? Was that sort of from the Soviet party that, Gorbachev said, well, we're doing this and we want you to do something similar? Or was that
From
more
what I
domestic?
understand, tell me if I'm wrong here, Luna.
Mm.
From what I understand, the Vietnamese were watching what was happening in the USSR very closely, but they saw it coming really in the 70s, right? I mean, they
Late 70s we saw
it was in the late 70s that the Vietnamese sort of realized that the Soviet Union was really going down the wrong path, and they never were taking orders from the USSR. I mean, if you look at like during the like when Stalin was still alive, he had a relationship with Ho Chi Minh that was a bit strained because Stalin wanted Vietnam to follow the path of Korea and the DPRK and basically maintain the division between the North and the South, because Stalin didn't think that North Vietnam, the Vietnamese communists could win and reunite the
Both
country.
much, when Stalin didn't trust Vietnam at that time in the 50s, it didn't just that Ho Chi Minh can lead the country into reunification.
Yeah.
And that's why Ho Chi Minh broke up with them. That was why actually in the 50s, the USSR and China both promised to send us a lot of aid if we listened to them, but we did not. We have to reunite our country at all costs.
Yeah.
That's why they dropped a lot of their aid to Vietnam, but we still forever being thankful for their support. But that is the part of history that is not really
It's complex, and it's something where you have to really get the nuance, because yes, China and the USSR were invaluable and provided so much material and so much aid and monetary aid and everything, but also there were major disagreements that were happening in these times as well. And I think what's really interesting is that Ho Chi Minh talked a lot about how important it is for a country to basically choose its own path and not to be reliant on any other country for its revolutionary struggle. That was a big talking point of Ho Chi Minh.
So I noticed when I came to Vietnam that the currency is highly devalued.
Yes.
It's very difficult for me to think in terms of hundreds of thousands and millions, and then to convert it into Pakistani rupees. When did this happen?
The 70s, and that happened in the 70s and the 80s when Vietnam was having subsidizing model. The money was still in the black market, but there was terrible inflation at that time. So in my mom's time, in the late 60s and early 70s, it was like 1 dong, 2 dong, 5 dong, and 10 dong. But then during that time, a subsidizing model too, the inflation rate was increased drastically.
So then now we come into the mid 1980s. There's reforms going on in the Soviet Union. Vietnam has just come out of another war, a major conflict, and there's skirmishes going on at the border. Inflation rate is very, very high. So what are the changes now that the Vietnamese Communist Party introduces in 1986? Firstly, what are they called, and what are the changes?
So after 10 years of trying to have a subsidizing model and lean toward communism, the moneyless society, we failed terribly because we did not consider the material conditions correctly at that time. We were too idealist and dogmatist at that time. Utopian, yes. So in the 1986, when we had the big National Assembly meeting and we re-evaluate what we did in 10 years.
Sorry, I want to throw something in that's really interesting, because I didn't know this before Luna taught me this. But before the Doi Moi Reconstruction era, Lê Duan did float the idea of having socialist-oriented market economy sort of system in the South, because Lê Duan thought that a market system would be more suitable to the conditions in the South. Am I getting that correct?
Exactly. He planned to have the North following subsidizing model, the South to be socialist-oriented market economy, and then he was people didn't agree.
Yeah, he lost the debate basically, and they decided.
So the whole country
subsidizing
model, and it caused a lot of tension in the country. And in the 1986, we a lot of mistakes that we did and failure that we had, and we consider again, the new economy policy of Lenin, and then look at China as being, even though we disagree with Deng Xiaoping at a big skirmish, but we still look at their path, the models are okay. When we learn from them, that was why in the situation where millions of Vietnamese people were starving to death, the country is being sanctioned, and there's no way out of this except we have to allow capitalism to be in our country so we can borrow money from the IMF and the World Bank. Not just get money for free. So we can persuade the IMF and the World Bank to lend us money so we can feed our own people, and then also to persuade the US to stop sanctioning us.
When did the sanctions stop?
So the conversation of sanctioning started from 1994 with the trip of who? Bill Clinton?
94 would have been Bill Clinton, yes.
The Bill Clinton, 1994, the trip to Vietnam, we started talking about that because after like 8 years, 7 years, applying the Doi Moi reforms, kind of proved them like, hey, Vietnam actually have a potential, blah, blah, blah. But then the very last, and that procedure lasted until 2006.
Okay.
So lasted like that. And I remember that in my living memories that I was around 15 at that time. And it was a huge news in 2006 that Vietnam finally totally normalized relationship with the USA. And 1 year after that, 2007, Vietnam joined the World Trade Organization, which is like the joyful news for the whole country. We were so happy that finally we can join with the world, we can trade things with the world, we will not be this poor anymore.
So in other parts of the world that are not too familiar with the objective conditions and the situation that Vietnam went through in the 70s and the 80s, people have the perception that, and this is not just with respect to Vietnam, but also with respect to China, that, now Vietnam is just a capitalist country. So it's no different from any other country. And so how would you respond to that? How is a socialist-oriented market economy different from a free market economy? And if so, how is it different? And how is it still, you say that it's still on the path to socialism. What evidence can you provide for that?
Yeah,
there's a few more. Well, I think Luna can really explain the nature of a socialism-oriented market economy. But just before that, I think there's a few misperceptions about the history leading up to it that I just want to make sure we iron out first. Because first of all, a lot of people there are a lot of people who say Vietnam became Dengist, and like whatever the word Dengism means, but there's a lot of people who think that Vietnam just followed the Chinese model. But really, the Doi Moi model is quite different from China's model, because the material conditions of China, which is a massive, today superpower, but either way, massive population of over 1 billion people, versus Vietnam, which is a relatively small country, especially during the time of the
at that time
model.
was just 50 million. So.
Yeah. So I think that what happened was both China and Vietnam were looking back to the NEP under Lenin and kind of drawing inspiration for that. And they were watching what each other were doing. But it would not have been possible for Vietnam to just copy China's model, nor for China to copy Vietnam's model. They just both happened to be in this same kind of period of time where the USSR was collapsing, the future of communism was kind of unsure.
The Cold War
was, evolving into this new stage that we're in now. It was in this like transition. But anyway, so I think that that's really important to understand, is that Vietnam was kind of trying to make their own path in a very hostile environment when their only really strong ally, the USSR, was collapsing, and there were not a lot of options. And there was a lot of coercive pressure being put on them by the USA, by its imperialist puppets around the world, and by the World Bank and the NED and all these other organizations. And I think that what they managed to do was navigate some very treacherous waters and maintain the revolution, even if they had to make some compromises and take some steps back. And obviously there were a lot of failures and problems along the way. And even today they're dealing with things like corruption and that sort of thing, which happens when you open the door to markets and that sort of thing. But I think it's really important to look at the historical development of Vietnam and look at how horrible the situation they were in. And just the fact that they managed to maintain Communist Party rule at all is pretty remarkable given those conditions. So I just wanted to kind of introduce that before.
I think you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah.
So what were the reforms exactly, and what was maintained from socialism, and what were the reforms towards capitalism? Let's walk through that a little bit.
So long story short, the Doi Moi reform means that first of all, we allow privatization, because before that, in subsidizing model, there was no privatization. Like my mom's time, like the whole entire village, will own a huge farm around the village, and they will work together.
Land.
Land and means of production and companies. So in subsidizing model, everybody own together, collectively own the means of production. So for example, like my mom and the other team of villagers, they work together in the rice farm, and then they harvest the rice. They brought all the rice to the big yard of the village, and then they will weight the rice, and then they will bring the parts of it to the government or something like that. And then for the rest of it, they like equally separated to the rest of the villagers. That is the subsidizing model. I already own the meat production like that. But then in the 1986, we allowed privatization, and at that time we started like giving land back to individuals. Before in the 70s and something, the land was given to community, to a commune, to a village, to a group of people. But in the 1990s, land was given to individuals. So we individually own a piece of rice farm, or some farm somewhere like I own one, something like that. I think that like we allow like private sector of economy to come to like so before that all the companies, all the business was state owned, run by the government, subsidized by the government. But after that, a person can own a company and then work with a farmer or something like that. So like possibly of that, and that was one of the big different compared to the subsidizing model. And then the money is brought back. But after the inflation, that was why we have like thousand and million dong and billion dong nowadays.
Okay, so but then that's just capitalism, isn't it?
Okay, I think there's a few things that I could throw in here. So first of all, you have to understand the nature of the importance of agriculture in Vietnam. 70% of Vietnamese people are farmers, and I think it's like close to 90% of ethnic minorities, 80 or 90%.
Yeah, 90% ethnic minorities.
Okay,
around.
So farming is the number one occupation in Vietnam, absolutely, and the farmland in Vietnam is completely owned by the workers. It's illegal for corporations or for-profit entities to own farmland.
Exactly.
Only individuals and cooperatives and families can own farmland in Vietnam. So in that sense, 70% of the economy right there, not in terms of GDP, but in terms of occupation, in terms of workers, occupation, is socialized already.
So one more time on that, please.
Yeah.
So you're saying big corporations, big agricultural businesses cannot own farmland.
They cannot own farmland. There are agricultural businesses in the sense of like processing food. So a for-profit business can own like a factory that packages milk into cartons, but they cannot own the farmland or the cows.
They can't even own the land that the factory is on.
They can lease the land, but they can't
lease the
own
land from the government, but
Right.
they do not own any land.
Right. That's an important distinction as well. So, and there are like a lot of other like restrictions on businesses in Vietnam that they don't have in capitalist, bourgeois democracies.
So the peasants basically own the land
Yes.
as a consequence of the land reform.
Yeah, and I think that's key to really understand how socialistic Vietnam really is, and what's the percentage of people that are employed by,
self-employed is
wage
55%.
55%.
55% is self-employed.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then. Yeah, and it's what, like 20? What's the percent that's employed by wage earners?
Wage owner is about 36%.
36%. Now that sounds confusing because 70% are farmers. The reason for that is because farming is seasonal, so a lot of people will go to they'll go to the cities to work, during some seasons and then go back to their farmland. But they own their own farmland, and any farmer gets, like when you're born in Vietnam in a rural community, you're assigned a free piece of farmland.
Yes.
If you want to go to the rural, like if you want to move from the city to the farm to farm, you can get a free piece of farmland. You just have to apply for one, and you'll basically receive one as long as you can prove that you can cultivate the land.
Actually, the government, many local governments in Vietnam are begging people to go claim farmland because we have so much farmland.
They're like, we have all this free
farmers.
land, please come take it. Yeah.
So Luna, you are Vietnamese.
Yes.
You were born here.
Yes.
You're telling me that just by virtue of being born Vietnamese, you get a piece of land from the government?
Yes, and yes, if it's based on the law and it's actually exists and it works, it's functioning, that if you are born in rural area, remember that if you're born in the city, it's not going to get this, but born in rural area, you will be assigned a piece of farmland. It could be either like rice farm or, like aqua farm, or like either a piece of like the forest too, if you're born in the mountainous area. And we have a maximum of farmland that we can receive.
Yeah, and Luna can send you the specific legislation that
Well, that's not
walks through it.
necessary.
And if you wanted to put that in like the graphics or something.
No,
Yeah.
and what percentage of Vietnamese people own their own homes?
In Vietnam, about 90% of Vietnamese people own our own homes, and 70% of Vietnamese are farmers, and all of them own their own farm.
90%?
90% of Vietnamese people own our own homes. Yes.
How is that possible? How did that happen?
The thing is that unfortunately we are very socialist. So we can own our own home actually, and then we do not have that. We have our first of all, like my mom and my dad, they bought their own home in the 90s, and they just paid it right up. It was very affordable at that time, and then also the bank loan is very affordable, and usually when you take a bank loan to buy your own home here, it takes you only from 5 to 10 years to pay off everything, and you do not have to pay like tax every year
Yeah,
for
that's
that.
very important. Yeah.
And yes, and
So Luna's
yeah.
parents own their home. They've had it since 1990.
90s.
Yeah, and they pay nothing. Nothing. They don't have to pay taxes. They don't have to pay. They just own it, and that's it. So like
Yeah.
that's really important. Now, it is important, I think, to note that this is a situation that could change for the worse, because right now there's starting to become kind of a housing, inflation and housing
Yeah.
prices, especially in the big cities where a lot of people are moving.
Yeah.
So that's a big problem. They are trying to do things to tackle that, like building subsidized housing for
Yes.
poor people and working class people. Another program that's very successful is housing that's built for union workers. So Luna and I, at one point, were looking for a place to rent, and we were looking at all these places. And one place we couldn't get into because we were not in a union, but they have like subsidized housing that is just for
workers.
Yeah, and you
if,
can explain
if,
that.
So that's like we call it like subsidizing housing in Vietnam for workers. Means that if you can, if you're working in any company or industrial zone, and the company pay your health insurance and what kind of social insurance for you, you can apply to buy a subsidizing house like that, and it costs like 50% compared to the normal market price
I
of
see.
an apartment.
And what percentage of workers are unionized in Vietnam?
The 90% of Vietnamese workers are unionized, and it is
90%.
90%.
With the goal of 100% by 2030, right?
30. In the next few years, it's gonna be 100%.
So that means the peasants and so on are also part of. Agricultural workers are also part of.
Yes, there are many unions in Vietnam, not just workers' union. We have a farmers' union, we have a women's union, we have a drivers' union, youth union, student unions. Like a lot of unions.
Tell me about the women's union. You were mentioning something on that earlier.
Yes.
What is
so
that?
The women's union in Vietnam is very, very powerful union, that it has political power, and it has a very strong and powerful saying in the government of Vietnam. The women's union in Vietnam started right from the 1930s, where we formed the Communist Party of Vietnam, and from the day one of the history of the Communist Party of Vietnam, the women immediately had our saying, had our power. And when Vietnam has had our first election in 1946, women immediately voted. There was no argument against that at all. It's just like, obviously, women have the right of that. And since then, the women's union been very powerful, and it exists in every single community. In every single community in Vietnam, there is a women union, and then there's a national women's union where they have a political voice, and they can make policy, and so that's policy that is suitable and good for the women, protect women from domestic violence, and help women from help women having our own career, something like that. And I personally, I'm having a bank loan from a women's union in my village, and it was like a support from the National Women's Union, to support the women in the local area if they want to have some money for their family, and the interest is super low. It's just like 8-9% a year.
I see.
Yeah, so I think it's also important, while we're talking about the question, is Vietnam socialist or is it capitalist, blah blah blah. Another thing that's really important to understand is that, as I was saying earlier, Vietnam had to make a lot of really tough decisions, and it's very difficult to navigate this really hostile capitalist world that we're in.
Yeah.
And Vietnam could have chosen to go the DPRK model, and completely
Cut
off. Yeah, because let's face it, if Vietnam didn't make these market reforms and didn't give in to the demands of the WED and all these sorts of things, then it would have become, separated off from pretty much the rest of the world, except maybe like the DPRK in Cuba and a very small number of other countries. So, they wanted to become part of the global community. They need certain resources that you can only get from the capitalist West, things like medication and technology. Yeah, a lot of
fertilizer,
microchips, all this kind of stuff. Yeah. So it was a tough decision, but I think that one of the things. What's his name? The is he the current prime minister?
Phạm Minh Chính.
Pham Minh Chinh. Yeah, Pham Minh Chinh wrote a great article about the path. It's like Vietnam's path to socialism or something like that.
That was the first secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam, Nguyễn Phú Trọng.
Nguyen Phu Trọng. Okay, yeah, Nguyen Phu Trọng. Yeah, he wrote that.
Yeah.
We have the way he put it, I think was really good. He's like, as we move forward in the socialist-oriented market period, we have to try to strengthen the characteristics of the economy that lend themselves to socialism, and try to weaken and negate the characteristics that are
Negate the
capitalistic.
contradictions
Yeah.
from the capitalism.
So what you're saying is, it seems that there's a free market economy on the one hand, and on the other side of that pole is what we would call a fully planned economy. And
Yeah.
you're kind of standing in the middle with what you call a socialist-oriented market economy, which you're saying is not a free market economy.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a
It
highly
is-
restrained market economy, and if you want to know, the people who can tell you the best about how restrained it is are the people who own businesses in Vietnam,
Yeah.
Right.
because they have to follow a lot of rules and regulations,
Regulations.
not least of which is allowing every worker to unionize. Essentially, if a
Exactly.
company has more than 5 employees in Vietnam and they want to have a union,
There
they
must be
must
a union
allow
within
a
6
union.
months.
There's
There
no-
So
must
you're
be a
saying
union.
we're staying at this guest house over here. You're saying if they have more than 5 employees,
Mhm.
They want
they
to
can
have
have
a union.
If
Yes.
they want to have a union, they will have a
There
union.
must be a
There will
union
be a
within 6 months
Yeah.
of the existence
Within
of
6
this
months.
business. Yes.
and 90% you said of workers
Yes,
have
90%.
such unions.
Yes,
Yes.
exactly.
Okay. So you're saying that what a socialist-oriented market economy does is that it tightly regulates capitalism in such a way that workers benefit from it? How does
Well,
that
it's not like a Nordic model system.
work?
And look, we're not even saying that this is the model that everyone in the world should adopt.
Mhm.
This is the model that Vietnam has chosen.
You
for
can look
better or
at
worse.
us, learn from us what we did right, what
Yeah.
we did wrong.
But the key difference, I think, between this system and like a Nordic model, Scandinavian socialism model, is that the Vietnamese people are still committed to building towards a stateless, classless society.
And we do this without exploiting other countries.
And this is
the
seen.
Nordic countries, they do that.
Oh, that's a really good point. Yeah,
Mhm.
they're not engaging in imperialism. They're not exploiting other countries to do so.
Actually, they're not socialism. They are welfare state. That
Exactly.
has similarity with socialism, but it's not because they're still doing it on the price of other countries.
The Scandinavian system, they want to kind of keep things the way they are forever and just maybe tinker with the system.
Yeah.
And they say that they want to like benefit workers through capitalism. The plan in Vietnam is to gradually get rid of all capitalism.
Yeah.
It's just unfortunately, if you take it at face value and if you believe the Vietnamese communists,
Yeah.
the goal is to slowly but surely get rid of the capitalist elements over time.
Yeah.
And they're doing things now which I think signal that is actually indeed what they're trying to do. So for instance, one of the big pushes right now for reforms is the workers cooperative legislation. They're reforming that a lot. They just passed a new update. So in 2013 they had a big legislative package of basically that walked through how you would form a cooperative in Vietnam and how it would be structured legally and that sort of thing. And now they're refining it. So now for instance, they've made a lot of rules about how
a member in the co-op cannot have more than 30% of the capital of the co-op.
they can't own more than 30% of the co-op.
Yeah, they cannot own more. So to make sure that everybody is equal.
And you cannot profit from investing in a co-op.
No.
It's against the law to like put money into a co-op and then charge interest or otherwise try to profit off of the cooperative. The whole point is that I think the way they put it in the legislation is that they don't want people to look at a cooperative as a venture or as
a profit.
a profit generating engine.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be a sustainable entity that exists for the workers and the members of that cooperative. So, and farming is like massively cooperativized in Vietnam.
Yeah.
The logistics and trucking industry is heavily cooperativized in Vietnam, and
small
now they're
scale industry too.
small scale industry. Well, they're starting to move into more like more and more small scale industry, as well as they're now trying to push for retail also to be more cooperativized as well. So,
So, off the top of your head, and I know you don't have the data in front of you, so it's okay if you don't remember it, but what percentage of industry, etc., would you say is state-owned versus what percentage would you say is
I have a
private? Because I know there's a bit of confusion here because there's lots and lots of enterprises that are part state-owned and part private, what we call public-private partnership.
Yeah.
and then there are cooperatives, and nobody knows where to put those.
Yeah.
Although I think they tend towards they don't tend towards profit maximizing corporations, right?
Mhm.
So what is the sort of ballpark figure here that we're talking about?
Okay, so 55% of Vietnamese workers are self-owned or in a cooperative.
Okay.
Around 8.4% working for state-owned companies.
Okay.
And around the other about 36%, something I could be wrong, but like 30% like owned by, private,
They're higher. They're
the
wage
higher-
earners.
the wage earners.
Yeah.
But then inside that 36% of that is around like only 8% working for international owned business.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, around like 27% owned by actually Vietnamese owned
Yeah.
business.
When we think about these numbers, we focus on the number of people employed because that's what really matters to us as as communists.
Yeah.
Is
So you're
like
looking at the relations of production.
Yeah,
you're looking at
like-
the relations that are formed during production.
exactly
Yeah.
where do they fall in the relationship that means of production.
Exactly.
and-
So we have the members of the workers union in Vietnam is 11 million. We have 11 million members workers union, and it's more than double of the member of the Communist Party.
Oh.
So actually, the workers union is way more powerful
Mhm.
than the Communist Party of Vietnam. Talking about the members.
Now, another thing that's interesting when we talk about the state-owned enterprises is that Vietnam has been very careful
Yeah.
to maintain state ownership of the vital industries like energy. So all the
Gas,
electrical
gasoline,
companies,
electricity,
Yeah.
water.
yeah, those are all state-owned.
Yeah.
Schools, hospitals.
Schools and
Yes.
there are a lot of state-owned ones. I don't think all of the hospitals are state-owned.
So
No,
hospital
there are
is
private
a
hospitals,
bit
but-
more complicated. We have state-owned, which is the best quality with the lowest price, and the national health insurance will cover that.
Mhm.
And we have a private hospital for like the high-income people,
Mhm.
and with usually the national insurance will not cover that, but usually for like wealthy people who can just like pay a lot of money to have a good service and like that. But like the good reputation is still the state-owned hospitals.
Yeah.
that can
And the
have
schools
service,
the best
low
schools in
price.
Vietnam are all state-owned.
The best schools are all state-owned. The private school have a really bad reputation. It's only like for rich people, rich kids. So our best is to pass the exam and go to public school.
Right. So people who can't pass the exam, they go to a private school. They pay a lot of money to go to a private school.
We can neither confirm nor deny that
Yeah,
statement.
neither
But
confirm nor deny.
I will say this too about the state-owned enterprise situation. When I was first starting to learn about this stuff, I was a little bit kind of, I guess you could say, angry or disappointed about the fact that some state-owned enterprises have been have been privatized in Vietnam. But then I read some articles about it, and you could believe this or not, but I think it's an interesting point to make. At least one of the reasons that the Tạp chí Cộng sản, the Communist Review magazine in Vietnam, made about privatization is that they do tend that when they're looking at whether or not they should privatize a company, they're looking at the risk for one thing, and should the people and should the state be taking the burden of risk in certain enterprises. So they're taking some enterprises that the state maybe shouldn't have a hand on if they're making things like consumer goods or things like that, where there's risk involved and that company might fail. And they're saying well, why don't we just let capitalists take the majority of that risk, and we'll maybe maintain some ownership in it, but we should be focusing on the core industries, things like energy production and healthcare and things that the people actually rely on and that national defense is relying on. And so I think that is something to consider, at least when you're I guess judging Vietnam from the outside looking in, about whether or not their decisions to privatize certain state-owned enterprises were appropriate or not.
Yeah.
I thought that was just an interesting point that I hadn't
Yeah,
considered
that is
before.
Yeah,
Now, one of the most one of the key things I think is also finance.
Yeah.
What's going on with finance? Is that mainly state controlled? What are the big
How many banks are there in Vietnam?
There are 49 banks in Vietnam.
exact number?
Yeah. Not that many for a country of over 100 million people.
Yeah, there are 5,000 banks in the USA.
I think more than that if you count all the different kinds of
There are
banks.
5,000 banks in the USA.
Yeah.
All right. So there are 49 banks in Vietnam.
Yes.
And what are these banks? They are foreign banks, Vietnamese
There are
banks.
4 national-owned banks. There are total 49 banks in Vietnam, and 4 of them are nationally owned, state-owned, and they are very powerful, and they cover everything. There are smaller banks owned by private capitalists, and usually people do not care about that. But it is accepted that we maintain that small number of banks. So even if when one bank like collapse or something, the other 48 will take care of that. The government will make sure they take care of that. There was a few years ago, there was a true story about the OCB bank owned by a rich capitalist, and he was in jail. He went to jail because of corruption, and then his bank was seized by the state.
It
The
just
state
was nationalized.
Nationalized his bank, and they bought that bank for $0.
So would it be correct to say that if I look at the overall assets of all the 49 banks, would it be correct to say that the majority of those assets are controlled by the state, or would it be correct to say that they are majority owned by private banks? What are the biggest banks? Are they state-owned or are they private?
The four biggest are the state-owned.
Four biggest are the state.
That's
Yeah.
owned.
One
And-
would be an agricultural bank, I'm sure. which
Yeah,
has
Agricultural Bank, and then Vietcom Bank,
What is that?
Commercial bank.
Vietnam Commercial Bank,
Okay.
Yeah.
and then there's another one, BIDV. BIDV is
Yeah.
like Vietnam,
Business and industry.
something
Something
like
like
that.
And
Yeah.
that's also state-owned.
Yes, state-owned.
Yeah.
Yes.
And your telecommunications, Viettel, I believe.
Viettel is the military-owned, actual state-owned.
Okay, so that's also state-owned, military-owned, in fact.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So you got your communication system, is your finance. What about transportation?
Transportation is heavily owned and subsidized by the government.
Trains,
Trains.
totally owned.
Chains owned by the government.
Yeah.
Okay.
State-owned.
Airlines, they have
Yeah, they have a
Vietnam
Vietnam Airlines,
Vietnam Airlines,
state-owned. The other
Okay.
three,
Yeah.
the
And
other
you have
three
private
like
as well.
private. Yes.
Okay.
Um,
And power is completely, you're saying,
completely state-owned.
Yeah.
Yes.
And water, etc. Of course.
Yeah.
is provided
Completely,
by-
yeah,
Yeah.
state-owned.
most of the bus so the city bus lines are typically city owned, and then for like the inner city
But I
the
didn't see a lot of bus lines, to be honest. I saw just people in scooters.
yeah
everywhere. That seems
well
to be
they're
preferred.
trying to so for instance in Hanoi the goal is to have what, like 50% of the city of the population to move to public transportation by the end of the decade.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Yes.
But scooters are still better than cars. I think.
True. Yeah. Well, yeah. Especially for these roads. And these,
Yeah.
Yeah.
a fun little fact about Hanoi. I don't quote me on the exact number, but when the French colonial administrators were planning the city of Hanoi in the 19th century, they were emphatic that there would never be more than like 50,000 people in Hanoi.
Well, 500,000.
500,000. Yeah, I don't know. Some
500,000. No,
absurdly
no,
low number.
And
Yeah.
now it is.
8 million people.
Yeah.
And I think Ho Chi Minh City is
It's like
14,
10 to
million.
14, 10 to 14 depends.
depending
Yeah.
on how you delimit it.
Well, part of
Yeah.
it's too that people are going in and out because of
course,
The immigration.
that always happens.
Yeah.
All right. So last question. So you're saying that the Communist Party, both because of the objective conditions, the specifically the war, but also just the fact that you emerged from a very brutalizing long period of colonialism without much industry to begin with, went through a historical compromise, an extended new economic policy, if you would like. But the goal is and always has been to industrialize society and to move towards socialism.
Exactly.
Now, the Chinese Communist Party, although you're obviously right that Vietnam hasn't, copied the Chinese Communist Party, but makes a similar
path,
argument,
Mhm.
and is embarking on a similar path.
Mhm.
The Chinese Communist Party, in fact, even give a date, saying by X, Y, Z date.
It's 2045 in Vietnam.
2045 Vietnam.
Oh, you already guessed my
That's
question.
that's the date that the Vietnamese Communist Party projects that they will be able to begin moving away from the socialist-oriented market economy towards what you would call full socialism.
Yeah.
Because by that point, they believe they will have built what they call a prosperous.
A prosperous economy,
Yeah.
wealthy people,
Yeah.
and then a happy society, or something like that.
Yeah.
And then we can move to the next steps. Actually, 10 years ago, we set a goal of 2050, but in the last 3 years, just said, 2045
They moved it
now.
up, yeah.
We moved it up 5 years ahead.
I see.
But I'm sorry, I stepped on your question.
No, that was exactly, you preempted my question. It was a good preemptive strike. But that really was my
Well, I'm
question.
from the U.S. We're very good at preemptive strikes.
But that really was my question. What is the sort of timeline that the Vietnamese government is, or state is, or Communist Party is looking at? You've
Yes.
already elaborated that it's roughly 2025.
Yeah.
And you have been growing at a phenomenal rate.
Yeah.
Till before COVID, if I'm not mistaken, Vietnam was perhaps the fastest growing economy in Asia. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yes, it is. And even during COVID in 2020-21, Vietnam still remained the fastest in Asia.
Mhm.
And And our goal is by 2025, we will eliminate extreme poverty.
Sorry, could you say that again? 2025.
Yes, by 2025, just like 2-3 years,
That's
we
in
will
2 years.
eliminate extreme poverty, because extreme poverty in Vietnam only 2.75% right now. And we use the multi-dimensional kind of system from the multi-dimensional standard from the United Nations, which is, like if the US apply the system, it's gonna be very high.
Yeah.
We do not calculate based on the income at all. We calculate based on if the house doesn't have electricity, clean
Right.
water, education, or healthcare.
Right. A multivariate sort of analysis.
Yes.
Honestly, I mean, I've only been here 5 days, but I haven't seen a single person on the streets asking for money. I haven't seen homeless people. Obviously, if I go to mountainous areas and other areas, I will see extreme poverty, which is inevitable, and I'm, or at least a higher concentration of that. But I'm really happy to know that the government is
Yeah.
targeting.
Yeah, exactly.
Extreme poverty.
And don't get mistaken. You might see that like their living condition might be poor to your eyes, but actually they own their own homes. They have a health care. They have a farm. They pretty much
No,
happy.
actually, I mean, to my eyes, because I come from Pakistan, maybe to a person coming from the first world country would be different. But
Yeah.
coming from Pakistan, I don't see the brutalizing kind of poverty that we see in South Asia,
Yeah.
which is, which I think you probably know is soul destroying kind of poverty.
absolutely.
We haven't seen that here. Honestly, we've seen people leading very good lives. I'm also very shocked by the fact that hygiene standards are extremely high. The roads are absolutely clean. There's no sewage. I've gone into small roads. I've gone into nooks and crannies looking for looking for bad things, and I haven't found them.
Yeah.
I found the sanitation works. Electricity is everywhere. The basic infrastructure of a good life is provided anywhere.
Yeah.
And frankly, I don't care if you don't have a Porsche and you don't have your big cars and so on. What's more important for me, and I think for most people across the world, is that people should have a decent and good humane existence. That's much more important than being super rich and having millions of people who are homeless and sleeping on the streets.
Exactly.
That is not a good model of development at all.
Exactly.
If everyone is having a certain standard of living, and there may be a few people who are above and a few people are below, that's still fine. So anyway, thank you, Luna. Thank you, Easy.
EJ.
EJ.
Yeah.
I know. I admit that. As soon as I said that, I said, "Oh, that's not."
I have one more thing I want to
Yes,
say
please do,
real
please.
quick. So
Yes.
there's one more thing that there are two examples to prove that how socialist Vietnam is in a socialist-oriented market economy. The first thing in that example is that when COVID-19 happened in 2020, Vingroup is a very big corporation in Vietnam, private owned. But during that time, the country needed a lot of ventilators, and we, the Communist Party of Vietnam, forced that corporation to stop making cars and start making ventilators.
I see.
And that corporation had to do it, make a lot of ventilators, so the government take it and give it to the hospital and then donate those ventilators to other countries. So that is a regulation, strong regulation that business in Vietnam have to deal with when they're in the disaster kind of situation. They have to follow the needs from the government. And the second is that we have price stabilization programs, which means that we will make sure that the prices of essential goods will always be affordable to the people, like rice, medicine, and in a swine flu kind of disaster, we make sure that the pork will be cheap enough for everybody to afford. And that is
There was
very
a point
important.
during the COVID lockdown when companies were having to sell eggs at a loss because the farmers had to get paid a certain amount and the people couldn't pay more than a certain amount. So the
company take the
businesses were
loss.
having to take a loss. Yeah. And if I guess for me I just want to end with a quote from Dr. Michael Parenti, which is, "I'm on the side of the people who feed the children. And in Vietnam, unlike my home country of the USA, the children don't go hungry here. 45 times more people in the USA, the richest country on earth, die of malnutrition than in Vietnam. And that's all I really need to know about whose side I'm going to be on." So, yeah.
Thank you, Luna. And thank you, EJ. That was
Thank you so much.
absolutely fantastic. I've learned a lot. And hopefully through this video, other people will also be able to understand the transitions that Vietnam is going through and be able to empathize with the peculiar and particular path they've taken.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time to explain.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having us. Yeah.
Come to Vietnam.
Yeah. Come to Vietnam.